It's so funny because now, as I'm telling you about this, and this is not something I really talk about much, I'm not sure if I've ever really described this story to anybody. But right now, as I'm telling you about it, and for people that are listening, maybe they will also pick up on some of this, I'm feeling a bit of that same kind of connection or energy that I had when I was at that retreat all those decades later.
Welcome to the Enchanted Earth Podcast, where you will hear stories of nature with the power to transform our lives. These sacred stories are begging to be shared now. So listen in as my guest today shares one of their own. So welcome, everybody. Today we have with us a real treat. We have Dr. Bonnie Bright. And let me tell you a little bit about Bonnie. She's a pioneering thought leader in consciousness, depth psychology, and soul-centered transformation. As founder of the Institute for Soul-Centered Psychology and Coaching, Bonnie blends Jungian, archetypal, and transpersonal principles with ancient wisdom traditions to guide others toward healing, meaning, and a deep connection to soul. She has also a special passion for ecosychology, nature, and place, and has also done extensive research on the symbolic meaning of colony collapse disorder, the mysterious mass vanishing of honeybees, which she explores as a powerful metaphor for our collective loss of home. So welcome, Bonnie.
Thank you so much, Maureen. I'm really grateful to be here. It's going to be a fun conversation.
Oh, yeah. I've been looking forward to this for a while now, and I really honor the work you've been doing. I've been following you for now over a decade with your Depth Psychology Alliance that you started, and have really appreciated the work that you're bringing out into the world. And we were just chatting about kind of some of the new projects that you have going on right now. You're quite a busy woman, and I so appreciate you taking your time.
Well, I appreciate it too. This is such an area of passion for me. And obviously, the work that you're doing by focusing on this whole idea around ecopsychology, nature, and of course, place, I think always goes into there. It's really such important work. And I'm sure that we'll get into more of that. But just when we look at what's going on in the world around us, and there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of very fast moving things happening out there, it really truly is nature that grounds us. And there's so much there that we can't even really understand until we begin to turn our intention and attention to nature and begin to really let ourselves be worked by it, be in partnership with it in a way. So it's an exciting place to really be able to put our attention, and also a very helpful one, I think, at this point in our evolution as human beings.
Yes. And I was just sharing that I have your book, Earth, Climate, and Dreams. I mean, the fact that you incorporated dreams into this book, I was like, oh my gosh, because I've been someone who has been following my dreams for the last 2 decades, literally writing almost every morning, taking time to contemplate, and then recognizing kind of the overlap between real world experiences and dreaming world experiences, which I don't know if you'd like to share anything about that.
Well, it's so interesting because I feel like, and this has been obviously many years coming to it, but it seems so natural now that I have this as a belief system or a value system, I guess. But we just have so much information that is embedded or encoded in nature. And, dreams are no different. In fact, it's so interesting because if we are paying attention, if we are really present with ourselves, if we are doing our best to have that open kind of awareness as we go throughout life, instead of just putting those blinders on and going through life without really noticing what's around us, and not being able to slow down and really take the time to be noticing where we are being informed in our lives all the time, then of course we're going to miss a lot. And I feel like life is informing us, dreams are informing us, nature is informing us. And again, if we just have the opportunity, and really it takes some discipline, I think, too, in the beginning to be able to make sure that you are paying attention to such things. And of course, there's a lot of different ways to get into that. There's a lot of different ways to find a place of stillness each day, whether it's through meditation or just sitting in nature or walking in nature or dropping into a space with some evocative music and letting yourself be there. And then, of course, the dream work. When we wake up first thing in the morning, that's when we are, I think, closest to what I like to call our soul self. You might call it soul, you might call it the universe, you might call it God, you might call it something else of your own liking. But truthfully, I believe that we are being informed by soul all the time. And it comes to us in these moments when we are most paying attention. It's coming to us all the time, I guess, really. But the truth is, we need to be able to tune ourselves, attune to it so that we can get the messages that are coming through.
Yes, and I love that. I love how you talk about that. And it's I feel like some of us, I know probably you and I have been doing this our whole lives in
Mhm.
some capacity, and of course, probably, deepening it as we mature. But it's just to recognize that our dreams and the natural world are like calling to us with nudges toward our soul purpose and to our calling and to what really lights us up. I think that just makes life so much more magical and fun and joyful, right?
Mhm. Yes, and magical and fun are such important words that you're using here. And all the way to the other end of the spectrum, of course, there are a lot of people who are suffering right now, and various different reasons. We have all of us always have all kinds of personal things going on, and those are challenging for us. And then, of course, again, we look out to the collective and we can see what we might consider challenges out there. But everywhere on that spectrum, from the magical and fun through to the just being able to be grounded and be able to be anchored into something that is deeper, so that when it seems like things are really going downhill and we're challenged, whether it is personally or collectively or both, we have that capacity to stay in that place of alignment and to understand that what happens in our world, in our lives, is not actually happening to us, it's happening for us. And if we can take that perspective of understanding how we are embedded in something bigger that is happening, then we can begin to change our entire attitude, our entire way that we are aligned with certain things. And it makes everything so much easier. It gives things meaning. And of course, that is what soul does. Soul is what makes meaning in our lives. So if we can just begin to understand that there are messages coming through, that there is wisdom here for us in every single moment of our lives, then we can take advantage of that and we can choose how we want to be in relationship with that. One of my favorite quotes from Carl Jung ever is he says, "Are we related to something infinite or not?" Now, this paraphrasing, he says, "Is man related to something infinite or not?" And he says that is the telling question of our lives. And one way I really love to think about that is it's about that word related. For me, it's obvious that we are related to something bigger than ourselves. And when I say ourselves, I mean our everyday egoic self. The ego is what drives us through our life. Obviously, the ego is what can help us make decisions and decide, do I go left? Do I go right? I often like to think about it as the driver of a limousine. We're driving this big car around and we're going where we can. But the truth is often in our limousine, until we know better, we don't have a GPS. We don't have a map. We don't know where to go and what to do. Our ego is doing the best that it can, but it is still kind of stuck in this work of trying to help us survive our childhood, even though fast forward several decades and we are already in this space of being able to make decisions and we should, quote unquote, know what we're doing. We still have a lot of parts of our psyche that has been we might say split off or stuck in certain parts of our lives where we were overwhelmed at some point and we just didn't know what to do with what was happening in our lives, often our young lives. And so if we understand that these parts are all trying to work together and the ego is trying to head those up, then we can also understand that the ego also needs a break sometimes. And that ego can really soften into an understanding that it is taken care of, that it doesn't have to be the only one going through our lives trying to make these decisions that are not always easy, that sometimes get us tripped up into things. And so, again, that understanding if we can be in relationship with something that is bigger than ourselves. in relationship with it. And what is that relationship? What does it look like? If we aren't paying attention to it, it's still going to be there and be present. But if we are seeking it out, if we can train ourselves through daily practice of some kind that works for us to really be in that place of listening, then again, that allows us to open up into those spaces and to gain that wisdom and to be able to not only change our own lives, but to find, again, the meaning within those. And then, of course, we can be of service to others too if we're anchored, or if we're in a place where everybody's panicking and jumping out of themselves and numbing and dissociating and all of these things that we do as human beings in order to try to protect ourselves so that we don't feel the pain and the suffering. If we can just move through those things, then we can be of service to other people too. And this is something that came for me as a very significant calling at one point in my life, very late, actually quite late in my adult life, but something that really is profoundly important and moving for me. And I sense this in like-minded others, like with you as well, and the work that you're doing.
Yes, I did come to my calling later in life as well. I mean, but there were inklings of it when I was preteen. There was definitely some nudges in this direction. And then, of course, I went off into marketing and worked for 25 years, in New York City and doing that, which I really enjoyed until I didn't any longer. And I actually had a dream when I got that night that I was laid off from my full-time position. But I was very lucky and I had time to just reflect and journal on my dreams. And I had a dream that particular night that was in nature, and it was nudging me to this. So it is definitely one of my backstories. But I want to hear was there a particular experience that shifted your career? Or was it just kind of like a slow building?
It's a great question. I can point to many of them. It's interesting because I'm not sure if the spiritual/nature piece came out first for me, at least in an obvious way. But as soon as I found myself on this path, so to speak, it became really obvious to me that nature is such a huge piece of it, as are the dreams. And again, I put all of this, I think a bit like Carl Jung did, into the bucket of soul. Everything that is not ego is soul, and we have the capacity to be able to be informed by that. For me, what happened was in 2006, which might have been kind of around that same time that you were also transitioning into something different. I was also transitioning out of the corporate world. I was also in marketing. I didn't realize we had that in common as our background. So that's very interesting. A fascinating career, fascinating field of work for sure. Very different than what this is, whatever this is that we're talking about. But when I was transitioning between jobs myself, leaving the corporate world and going more into a consultant kind of phase at the time, I decided to attend a retreat, and the retreat was on the Enneagram. So I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's basically we talk about it as a personality typology system, and yet it's so much more than that. For me, I've now studied hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours in it, and I've used it for almost 25 years. And it has really revealed itself to be this very powerful system in which we can look at it and identify where we are in that, and then be able to start to understand what is calling us forward, what are our gifts and our calling. And it was definitely a big part of what helped me to move onto this path as well. But in 2006, I decided to attend this retreat, and it was in Pennsylvania. It was in the very, very deepest part of the woods in Pennsylvania. I was not really familiar with that. I grew up in a state where it's cold desert, not a lot of trees. It was a very different kind of experience. And that Enneagram retreat was really, really powerful. And one reason that it was so powerful is because we were doing a lot of somatic work. And in the Enneagram, and not to diverge too much because I really want to come back to the nature piece, but it's so interesting how they dovetail. In that retreat, we were doing all this somatic work. And in Enneagram, I am part of the triad, or the three numbers out of the 9 types that are considered head-centered types, which is really not surprising. I think our culture is actually quite head-centered at this stage, and what that means is we rely on our heads to make those decisions and to motivate us and to drive us and to decide what we're going to do in life. And of course, the other two centers in the Enneagram are heart-centered and belly-centered. And so what we really need is a balance of those three centers. But I had not paid a lot of attention to the somatic stuff. For me, and I think for a lot of us in our society, it's easier for us to escape whatever pain, suffering, or trauma that we have experienced in especially our young lives, by coming up with these techniques to be able to numb ourselves or to distract ourselves from what it is that's actually going on within. And so I think there was something, and I know there was something very powerful about doing that somatic work of becoming embodied, of getting into our bodies. Our bodies are absolutely the greatest nature, right? They are immanent to us, and we know it and we feel it when we're in our bodies. But if you have a long habit of not paying attention, and in fact, maybe have even gone to the unconscious effort of trying to set yourself aside from your body or dissociate because you don't want to experience being here in the midst of what could possibly be trauma and suffering, of course, we do that as much as we can unconsciously. And so that retreat really opened something for me. I didn't realize it at the time, but the kind of the finale of the retreat was doing some holotropic breath work, which is a process that was created by Stan Grof, one of the pioneers of transpersonal psychology, a really amazing guy. I've had the opportunity to work with him many, many times now on holotropic breath work. But that time was my first opportunity to try it. And it shifted something for me very profoundly. I didn't really understand what was happening in the moment. But in that holotropic breathwork experience, basically you have evocative music and it plays for about 3 hours. And then you are lying on a mat and having your own experience, whatever that is for you. You go in with an intention of some sort to have the experience, essentially. And then whatever happens for you happens. And for me, there was a moment in the middle of that, almost dreamlike, very dreamlike, I guess I would say, where I had this understanding that there was energy in the earth. And this was not maybe a new idea to me, but the imminency, I think, of being in my body and having those experiences allowed me within that session of holotropic breath work to have this experience of imaginally, and I say imaginally, and we dismiss that quite readily sometimes in our society. But of course, Jung said that image is the language of soul. And everything that we need to learn and understand then about soul can be shown to us or given to us in images. And so it's really important that we have access to imagination, because images is the root of imagination. And that is where we can often get a lot of that wisdom. It's one reason that dreams are also so compelling and so revealing for us. And so in that process, I had this experience of being able to thrust my hands into this earth, like this moist earth that was there. And I had been reading some mythology from Russia about Mokosh, who is the goddess of, she's called Moist Mother Earth in the Russian language. And so I just had this moment. It was probably, a couple of hours into this 3-hour session. And I had this experience of just thrusting my hands into the earth where I was and sitting on the earth and just feeling this energy, real energy in my ordinary experience, even though I was kind of in a different sort of dimension or experience within the holotropic breathwork, where that energy just began to work me and started coming up through my body and into my hands. And it moved me into this place of understanding some things about the 4 elements, earth, water, fire, and air, and how each of us are made up of those elements, not just physically, but also psychologically. Our psyche has access to those. And there's ways in which I think the ancients knew how to use those, manipulate those energies to be able to help people to be more whole and to get what they needed and wanted. And so it was just a super powerful experience. It turned something on for me that I didn't understand at the time, didn't realize what was happening. It actually sent me into what Stan Grof calls a spiritual emergency, because something very spiritual happened to me and it changed my worldview so much that I did not know what to do with that. So when I came back from that, and I can say more maybe at some point if it comes up, or if you're interested, but just to say, when I came back from that retreat, I had this massive experience, But at the same time, it didn't fit with my world the way that it was at the time, even though I was already in a master's program studying depth psychology. So you would think there would be more of a container for it. And there was. And it was just very, very, very early in the process. And so it was quite a process to transition out of that.
Wow. Wow. What an amazing experience. And yeah, it's like that part of integration. You come back out of this experiences, you've gained some knowing, but it's how does that fit into my worldview now? What is my worldview? What am I supposed to
Exactly.
do with this kind of experience? And
Yeah. One thing that it opened up for me as I look back on it now was this. I think something about the energy and the earth energy in particular opened me really so much up to what I would call now the invisible world. And within that invisible world, nature really is truly still at the base of that for me. Again, I mentioned being in the Pennsylvania mountains, and it was in July and it was bear country. And I had not grown up really much around that kind of thing, not a lot of trees, again, as I mentioned. And so there was a night that I think was the last night of that retreat where a bunch of people had kind of stayed up late just talking about the content and the retreat and some experiences and things like that. And we were up quite late. There was just a small group of us, maybe 6 or 7 people. And as it got later and later, people kind of all of a sudden said, well, gosh, it's like 2 o'clock in the morning. Maybe we should go to bed. And so everybody got up to go disperse. And I realized for the first time at that moment that everybody else was staying and sleeping in the building where we had been meeting. My building, my dormitory was about half a mile down the road, and I literally had to walk back to it in the night by myself. And I was not very comfortable with this at all. And what happened, Maureen? It's so interesting because I knew I had to do it. I didn't really have a choice. Everything I owned was down in that other room, and I didn't want to wait till morning. There was no place for me to stay. So I set out on this journey, if you want to look at it from that perspective. And what happened was, as I was going down this road, and it was a nice paved road, it was the only one, I think, within miles probably, but it did connect these two buildings. And it was very, very foggy. So I couldn't see more than maybe 15 feet in front of me or around me, maybe even 10. It was quite narrow. And I decided to kind of not run per se, but I was sort of loping down this hill as I was moving through the dark and the fog and just trying to keep myself kind of in this process of being able to not panic and not be too scared. And what happened is several of the beings, I'll just call them that, energies that showed up in the form of animals in my earlier holotropic breathwork that day or the day before, they showed up with me when I was walking or loping down that slope going back to my own dorm. So all of a sudden, I just had this felt sense of this presence of, for example, a deer or a wolf or a snake or something, because my journey in holotropic breathwork, for whatever reason, had been very filled with a lot of different animals. And I think it's part of that earth energy that I was tapped into in that moment. And that experience for me was probably the most real, quote unquote, engagement with what I would call the invisible world that I had to date. It was very profound. I felt like those animal energies were literally right there next to me. I literally felt like I could see them with my third eye or my psyche, and I could feel their presence as I was going down there. And the next morning, I did make it safely, obviously. The group of us, we all made it down there together. And the next morning, I could feel that something had definitely shifted with me energetically. And again, there was more that continued to unfold from all of that. But it was a profound introduction to this understanding of not only animals and nature and our place in it and with it and their contribution to us, but also the archetypal energy of the animals and of nature that are here for us to be able to accompany us and to give us that wisdom. Because an archetype, as Jung described it, is a pattern. It's basically a recognizable pattern. So, in our culture, we can say any number of words like teacher or doctor or healer or warrior, anything like that. And we don't have to describe or define it. We all know what that is. It's almost like shorthand. We have a word, and with that word comes all of this information that's encoded in that word. Animals are the same way. So it's why when they show up in our dreams or even in our everyday waking reality, which could be considered a waking dream, it's always helpful to go and look and see what about that animal biologically, physically, what are their habits, what are their traits, what are their characteristics, how are they born, how do they live their lives, how do they take care of their young, to look at these things from a process of amplification, as Jung called it in dream work. And that is to try to understand everything that we can about them, and then to be able to apply that to our own lives as a metaphor. Because there's going to be a pattern in that that somehow overlays or overlaps with our own lives and what's going on in our own lives. And then we can start to see what the message is there for us when these animals show up for us in our lives, whether it is in sleep or in waking life.
Yes, so beautiful. And I know that the book Animal Speaks has been on my shelf for the past few decades for that particular purpose, to look up what the attributes of that animal are and what the metaphors are. And they're just amazing
Absolutely
guides
amazing
for
guides.
us.
And there's more to it, too. Again, this process of dream work is just so powerful. And I love when we mix the two, the eco-psychology and the dream work, because when we look at it from the standpoint of amplification and seeing what all these animals are actually about in everyday life, we can get the biological patterns and the archetypes that are coming through there. But we can also engage with the animals or these energies of animals, archetypal energies, and be able to dialogue with them or to interact with them in some way. And so that brings it from the amplification and the metaphor in that way down to something that is also more personal to us, that our own psyche is interpreting or translating, coming from our own experience. And also, if you listen to somebody like James Hillman, who was a Jungian, is considered widely the father of archetypal psychology. He did extend beyond some of what he learned from Jung and move into much more of what he considered archetypal psychology. But he always liked to say that the animal is the image, or the image is the entity that we are dealing with, and it needs to be able to act on its own. It needs to be able to be autonomous. We don't want to take what we think we know and bend it and manipulate it to fit our lives. In fact, we do want to go and dialogue with whatever energy or animal that is, because it has information of its own that it can provide to us that we wouldn't necessarily have come into on our own. But we have to be able to listen and to take those steps to engage with those archetypal animals.
So I'm just thinking of a listener wondering, well, would that extend to other living beings like trees, like clouds?
Absolutely. I mean, I think obviously you already know the answer, but it's a great line of discussion, and it does bring me into maybe some of the more specific experiences that I've had personally that I really wouldn't have seen coming. But of course, as you said at the beginning, when we look back at our journeys, it's so easy to see in hindsight kind of where our soul was guiding us to and where it was taking us. So that parlays a little bit into the book that you were just sharing, this book, Earth Climate Dreams, which began as a symposium, really. It's a series of interviews, essentially, with 12 different depth psychologists and scientists that I interviewed, not unlike this. And we really just had, a vast range of experiences that were discussed in those. But one thing that came for me out of this whole idea of understanding that nature is intelligent and that we can engage with not just animals, but everything is, one day I was driving in my car I think it was the end of 2006. So it's been a while. And I was listening to the radio, and they were talking about this phenomenon that had just begun being noticed called colony collapse disorder, which you mentioned at the beginning. And colony collapse disorder is this mass vanishing of the honeybees. And at the time, it was just starting to be noticed, where beekeepers, commercial beekeepers, would go and lift the lids off of their hives to be able to check their bees and take the honey or whatever it is that they were doing. And noticing that, unfortunately, some of those hives, a lot of those hives right around the same time, were actually almost completely empty. Like they hadn't been checked in a month or two, and suddenly went from maybe 50 or 60,000 bees in an average hive to almost none. And the weirdest thing was, Maureen, that the hive was not completely empty because the queen bee was still there, along with just a handful of her attendants, which she absolutely has to have in order to survive. And then the unhatched brood of the bees that had not yet come out of their cells to join the hive with the living. And this is so bizarre because what society would abandon their queen and their and all of the babies, the unborn babies especially, and just not come back. So of course, what we know now is that the bees aren't just vanishing. What is happening, and there are a lot of theories out there for why this is still, even though it's been almost 20 years since this phenomenon really began. What they really have recognized is that the bees aren't able to find their way home to the hive. Something is getting in the way of that signal for them to be able to return. And so, of course, they're going out to find the nectar and pollen, which is so critical for the hive, but they're not able to bring that back to sustain the hive, to feed the hive. And then the bees themselves die. And then as they don't come back with the sustenance for the hive, then of course, more bees have to kind of change their roles because they're all assigned roles. Very interesting whole architecture of a hive as a superorganism, and how a hive has its own mind as more the sum of its than the sum of its parts. But of course, as more bees go out and they don't come back, then eventually the hive ends up failing, and that is what they're finding. So, looking at something like that and seeing how that is taking place, I had this massive energetic kind of response to just hearing the person on the radio talking about this. And I didn't know what it was at the time. I didn't know why that was so critical at the time, but it did instill in me a desire to begin to just research that and see what was happening and try to familiarize myself more with the situation and understand. And then, of course, as a function of depth psychology or soul-centered psychologies, what we know is, again, it's not just about researching the factual evidence, but it's also then about beginning to use some of these tools that we now understand and know about, like dialoguing with, like interacting with, like what Jung called active imagination, which is to put yourself in a situation where you won't be disturbed, a meditative kind of state, and to be able to go in and engage and ask whatever it is that you are looking for and see what comes out of that. And so for me, that looked like me going in and calling on the bees and engaging with them and asking them what's happening and seeing what our relationship was like and developing a relationship with them literally. And this just became such a powerful, powerful pull for me that I decided to write my master's thesis on it. I had just started a depth psychology master's program at the time. And then by the time I got around to doing my PhD, I had finished that master's thesis, and it was a very moving, a very powerful process for me. It took me a few years to do it because I was so engaged with the interactive piece. I would do shamanic journeying with bees. I would walk on the beach and I would find bees in the ordinary world, just hundreds of them dead all along the shore. I remember walking along the shore in Santa Barbara, California one day, and I must have gone a quarter of a mile and just hundreds of them just dying on the beach in front of me. And so when we put ourselves into these kinds of states, into these kinds of relationships with nature, nature of course responds. It's just waiting for us to look at it, to give it that attention, right?
Oh, yes, yes. I think it's when I go out into nature, I feel like it's just it's just waiting for us to acknowledge its presence and its sentience.
Yes.
It's alive. All of nature is alive and wise and wanting
Wanting
relationship
relationship
with
with us. That's
us.
so beautiful. And I agree. And I realize I didn't actually specifically answer your question about trees and clouds. Are they imbued with consciousness, and can we engage with them? Yes, of course. And we know more and more too. Quantum physics has been around for 100 years now, practically, but it is really finally starting to get some of the attention that it deserves. And what we are understanding from quantum physics is that in the universe, perhaps everything is actually made out of consciousness. So that means that, of course, we think human beings have consciousness and we have our brains, and that's what makes it possible. But in that study of consciousness, there is what they call the hard problem of consciousness, and that is that we cannot find, as scientists or human beings, where consciousness is coming from. It is not evident that is coming out of our brain in any way, shape, or form. Instead, probably what it looks like is that our brains are more like receivers and that we are able to actually pick up on the consciousness that is already available to us, that we are essentially swimming in all the time. And if we can just attune to that, then we can tap into the information that we are looking for and that we are needing to be in that relationship.
Yeah, and I just love how some people are coming out talking about light is consciousness and water is consciousness, and it's really like the background, the foundation of everything arises out of this consciousness.
Yes, and I love that you put it that way, because everything arises out of the consciousness, meaning everything that we know of and we can think about, right? But behind that everything that you just said is literally the idea of everything, including ourselves. And so I like to believe that, well, there's been so much evidence about, particularly from near-death experiences, that people have physically died, have had experiences where they could literally see and talk about what was going on in the room where it was when their vital signs had stopped and they were, and not considered necessarily technically alive anymore, but had come back somehow and were able to tell about this and tell things that there's no way that they could possibly have known. Well, if that is the case, and I do embrace that theory myself, then of course it's easy for me to think that we were consciousness before we came into these bodies and into this world of form. And therefore, we do have access to that consciousness because we are consciousness. And yes, of course, light holds consciousness. We are photons. We are bodies of light. And of course, water has consciousness. There's been some really cool experiments done for many, many decades of grabbing the consciousness from water and being able to show it so that we can see what's happening with that. And so there's been some really cool experiences and experiments, and those continue. And of course, this takes us all into that whole idea of what's called panpsychism these days. And that is that everything in existence is ensouled, everything is alive, and that we have the opportunity to tune into that. And, most of us just go through our days with the blinders on. It's so easy. You and I have both been there. I mean, I have gone through a shift in my own life where now I'm much more in tune with this flow of nature and what is here right now in this present moment, not nearly as much in my head as I used to be. But it is the human condition for us to be unconscious until we're not unconscious anymore. And of course, that was a lot of Jung's work as well.
It's so true. It's once we become conscious, we're still go into states of unconsciousness constantly throughout our day. And then it's like, it's coming back to the present moment and being aware and being conscious of what's occurring. Yes, that has definitely grown for me in the last 20 years, although I had, like I said, some inklings of that in my childhood, getting interested in astrology when I was 12, and things like that. So I just want to, what were kind of the foreshadowing for you? Do you have anything as a child or maybe a young adult that foreshadows what you do
Everything? It is such a good question because, of course, in hindsight, it's easier for us to look at these kinds of things and identify them. And I just so appreciate the question because it's not even something I would have normally thought about. But of course, once you move into this, it's easier and fun to look back at your life and just see all of those things. And of course, James Hillman wrote a really excellent book called The Acorn Theory, which is, yes, it looks like you know that book too. Do you want to say something about that before I go on?
Oh, I just loved it. It just so resonated with me. The idea of the acorn and the demon hoarding all of that potential.
The idea is that we all have within us from the moment we're born, and obviously I would say before that even, we have those seeds of what it is that we have come here to do on this planet, of what we are here to live into, of the journey that we have set ourselves on. Because if we were consciousness before we came here, then I'm guessing we probably had some say in how this whole thing was going to unfold, because who would not want to come to a place where we can have our senses, hearing, seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, these things are so rich and so multi-layered. I don't know if we can do that without a physical body, right? It just doesn't seem as obvious. Also, we can be here and have relationships. I mean, we learn everything we know from our human relationships and our relationships with nature, obviously. And so it's really just such a powerful thing to be able to look into this. So looking back at, as Hillman said, we have all of those things within us. And then it's so interesting how we can look at people's lives and look back, just as you're asking, and say, oh, wow, there's a breadcrumb, there's a marker, or there's something that's pointing us toward where it is that we're going. For me, it's quite interesting because I grew up on a farm. And, back in the day, that was not abnormal where I grew up. It was very rural in Idaho, southern Idaho, Pacific Northwest. And a lot of people were farming at the time. I think that's changing a bit now. It's getting harder and harder to do that. But for me, growing up on a farm, I was always expected to work on the farm and help out. And there was always a lot to do. And I totally understand that now. And I just remember there was a moment, it was so interesting. I was about 16 years old. So a little bit later, perhaps, and I know there were lots of other experiences earlier in my life. I can point to pets and animals and, dogs and all kinds of things. But there was this moment that I remember that really was something that shifted in me. And my dad had dropped me off at a field at one point where I was supposed to be doing something, irrigating or weeding or something, I forget. And it was quite early in the morning and I was quite tired. And he left and said, I'll come back and pick you up at a certain time. And I worked for a while and I just started feeling really tired. And I just decided to lay down on the ground right there where I was. The sun was shining. It was a beautiful morning, birds and just absolutely idyllic. And I didn't mind being out there working in it, but I was really tired. So I just literally laid right down on the bare earth and fell asleep probably for a few minutes. I don't think it was very long. But I just remember when I woke up, there was something about the awakening where I didn't know where I was, but there was not any sense of concern or even wondering. It was just this absolute, complete connectedness to something where I felt myself just held right where I was by the earth. Like there was nothing else that was interfering with this sense of incredible peace and holding. And my brain, I can tell you right now, was not engaged at all. And I think that probably was a big piece of it because I was literally, and it's so funny because now as I'm telling you about this, and this is not something I really talk about much, I'm not sure if I've ever really described this story to anybody, but right now, as I'm telling you about it, and for people that are listening, maybe they will also pick up on some of this, I'm feeling a bit of that same kind of connection or energy that I had when I was at that retreat all those decades later, both with the holotropic breathwork and being able to thrust my hands into that earth energy and just feel that connection. I mean, I essentially disappeared as an individual thought process, as an individual brain, and I was just part of that something bigger. And at 16, everything's kind of topsy-turvy anyway. The hormones are raging, everything's changing. We're very socially aware of how we fit into our cliques and school and all of those kinds of things. And yet for me, that was just absolutely a connection that I will never forget. Once you go through something like that or experience something like that, it does change you. You can never go back. You can never unknow what you know. So, and I've had since then many of those kinds of experiences, but that was really the first one that I remember so profoundly. And I do think that it really set the opportunity for me to see what I was being pulled toward or what was already there for me all the time if I just knew how to access that.
That is such an amazing moment.
I think we don't know especially when we're younger, even when we're older, we don't know to ask for those kinds of experiences or to go seek them out per se. And when they are given to us through such grace, that's what it is. We need those kinds of experiences to be able to shore us up because otherwise it's true. We just get so caught up in the challenges of life. And so if we talk about these things, it does give us that opportunity to really understand how critically important it is that we seek out these moments. We're not always going to just be given something profound like that the moment that we ask for it. But again, it comes back to if we are open and we're listening and we're paying attention and we're engaging, then of course those moments are going to come to us way more frequently because we are in that stage, that frequency of being able to receive them, that receptiveness of the antenna.
Right, with an open heart. And like you said, what was so critical to that experience when you were 16 was the fact that your mental capacity wasn't completely engaged yet. You were just in that waking stage, so you were really in your body still. And so I'm curious, you had that experience and then you got up and went about your day. I mean, was this something that you shared with anybody at the time? Were you kind of seeking, like, what was that? Or was there a knowing within you that you
Such a
recognized?
great question. It's so interesting. At 16, I wouldn't say I knew anything at the time. I probably would disagree with that, but it's so interesting. I didn't really have a structure or a framework or a container to talk about something like that. And even if I had, I'm not sure if I would have, because, when these things happen to us and we've all had something like this that we can point to, perhaps that is really a different kind of experience like this. But even if I had had the opportunity to talk about it, I think I would not have, because it was definitely something that felt very, very intimate, felt very much a part of the deepest part of me. And I say me, but of course, that's the capital M on the me, right? That's the me that is in tandem, in participation with this world as we know it. And the irony is, you'd think, okay, well, I grew up on a farm, so I was close to the earth and nature, and I was working all the time, and et cetera, et cetera. But if you look back on it from a certain perspective and you think about colonization at all, farming the way that I grew up with it was very much a colonization of the earth, constantly using pesticides and fertilizers of all kinds, chemical fertilizers, and, manipulating the earth to make it grow the crops. And particularly where I was living, where I grew up, it's a cold desert. And so there's not a lot of water. So the water is a very, very precious and valuable resource and has to be brought in, has to be done right. But there's a lot of manipulation that goes into making those crops grow in the way that they do. And so I think it's just so interesting, because ultimately what I kind of experienced there was this, on one hand, living into this experience of the colonization of the land, not even recognizing that that's what it was. I didn't even have an understanding of that concept, but then being given, again, by grace, by something bigger than me, this felt sense of experience of what actually was there for me. And I've had this so many times since then. It's easy once you've had that experience, then you can start to recognize the pattern, right? It becomes archetypal. And so I've just, since then had these experiences where, knowing that I wanted to seek out some kind of a relationship with nature or some kind of an experience with nature, I have another experience that actually kind of dovetails with that. It doesn't seem connected at the front end, but when I can feel into the experience and in the back end, the interior part, it makes so much sense. And that is that many years later, a few years ago, I traveled to the Big Island of Hawaii. And there's one thing that you can do on the Big Island, which you can't do in a lot of places in the world, and that is to be able to swim with manta rays. And manta rays, if you know anything about them, they are some of the most magnificent creatures that you can possibly imagine. Some of them have a wingspan of up to like 24, 26 feet. So these are like giant creatures. And here on the Big Island of Hawaii, where I live now, they turn on lights at night that, like, hotels or restaurants can bring in these big floodlights and turn them on, and it attracts plankton. And then the plankton in turn is what attracts manta rays, because that's what they eat. And so the manta rays will come up in response to the plankton coming to these lights, and they'll just start swimming around and circling and eating the plankton. They just scoop it up. They don't even have a mouth that closes. They just have this big grill and scoop up the plankton, and they just swim around in circles. And I'm a scuba diver. And so I had the opportunity to go into the water and drop down to the bottom of the ocean there were people that just sit in a circle on the bottom and they give you a light, a big floodlight, and you just shine it up so that the plankton will come. And then the mantas just swim around your head and they literally can touch you sometimes. They're that close to you. Now, you're not supposed to touch them, obviously, for obvious reasons, but they literally just swim right past your head, right past your being. And they're these giant and they're so graceful and they're so otherworldly, Maureen. I mean, I have never had an encounter with an animal or a creature like that. It was just so, there was so much presence and so much otherworldliness, so much mystery to it. And I was just so completely taken by that experience. And I've done it now more than once, but in that first experience that I had, when I came up after that experience, I was still very much in that place of just magic, the magic and the mystery of encountering something that I really didn't even have words for and had certainly never experienced before. And when I came up, however, I was trying to swim back to the boat and I was having a really hard time. I was choking and coughing and clearly had some water in my system I needed to get out and I didn't have any energy to swim. I literally had to call somebody to come help me get back out of the boat. And when I got back on the boat, there was a photographer who had been taking photos with people on the manta tours for years and years. And she was a manta ray advocate and she was very knowledgeable. And she said, I think maybe your rental gear for the scuba equipment had a leak in it, or sometimes they get these little pinhole leaks and water can come in and you get it in your lungs. Because I was really not in good shape at all. And we were still on the boat back. And she said, if I were you, I would go straight to the nearest emergency room because she said, you don't sound good. And I've seen this before and you could literally die with water in your lungs. I was not happy to hear that, but I was not having a good experience. And when I came back and got back on shore, the question was, do I drive 45 minutes to get to the nearest ER? And it was already night and not something that I really wanted to do. And yet I was not in good shape. And so I was kind of in this place of, I don't know what to do right now. And somehow, again, just the power of the manta rays and what I had just experienced and that sense of otherworldly power that I couldn't quite relate to, but there was something there that I recognized, to use a word that you used earlier, something there. And I just instinctively called on the manta rays and asked for help. And I remember just kind of, not to be too graphic, but eliminating as much of that water as I could, just heaving that water out and got in the car to go back. And I was fortunately not driving, but there was a moment along the way when I was still determining, should I go to the ER or not go to the ER? And I just asked the person who was driving the car to stop the car. And I got out. And again, I just laid down right on next to the side of the road. There was some lava and some weeds there. And I just laid on that, still warm from the sun of the day. And I was there for probably about a minute. And all of a sudden I could just feel that water just coming up. And I just turned and I gave it a last good shot. And I knew the moment that water was out of my system critically. How did I know that? I don't know, but I could just tell that something had happened and I had turned a corner and I could feel the presence of those manta rays. I don't know why I went through that experience. It felt very, very, very shamanic to me because there was something that I was calling on that came through to help me to eliminate that so that I didn't have to go through whatever the rest of that process would have been. And again, just we can't know until we know what's out there, but we also can't know until we do the work of opening ourselves up to that. And if it requires sitting in meditation, even if it was 5 minutes a day, that's a good place to start because it's what gets us in contact with that. Sitting with a tree, you mentioned earlier, I've had many experiences of not just interacting with trees, not just talking to trees, but actually being trees with other trees and being rocks. Oh, love rocks. Don't even get me started on rocks. But you get the idea.
Oh my gosh. Well, that sounds like a wonderful wrap up. Some really great action steps for people who want to have this deeper relationship.
And again, so much information there. For me, it was always really hard to stop or to slow down enough to be able to take that time. I knew I should meditate. I like to spend time in nature, but I was always so busy, always so many things to do, always so many, things in my brain to be working on. And yet that is when we can look back and see those breadcrumbs that are leading us to this idea of being connected with nature. That is really where we have to go. And I would just say to everybody, if you're struggling in your life, this is how you move into a new way of relationship with whatever it is that you're struggling with. You slow down, you get connected with what's here right now, and you get into the living world out there and tap into that consciousness. And then we can see that we are exactly where we're supposed to be. We can gain the wisdom that we are here to gain because it is an initiatory journey for us. And then we can be able to integrate that and to move on. And nature as an integrator, there's nothing like it. So that's a pretty much a given one. If you've had a big experience, that is the place to go for sure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your beautiful stories.
I really just encourage everybody to have your own experience of it. It's really amazing and so worthwhile.
And if you were listening to this, please like, share, and comment. We will reply. We'd love to hear what this brought up for you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you so much, Maureen.
Thank you for being a part of the Enchanted Earth podcast. Please hit the subscribe button so that you'll know when we publish another inspiring episode. Check out my book, The Enchanted Earth, available wherever online books are sold. Thank you and have a magical day.